Chapter 18. Jim Garfield Stalks Joe Fungo. Jim Garfield rode a black mountain bike through the peaceful residential neighborhood an hour past dusk. He was keenly aware that he looked out of place on a bicycle, and aware that he looked out of place wearing a Houston Cougars sock hat and a Houston Cougars sweatsuit. But Jim Garfield was the one person he did not now want to resemble. For 3 nights he had been circling Joe Fungo's house. Tonight he hoped to kill him. Fungo knew that Jim Garfield had been displeased with him. That is why he would only meet with him in a public area. So Jim Garfield met him yesterday at the food court in the mall. There he affirmed that he was angry, but he also told Fungo that he was irreplaceable. He might be willing to give him a chance to redeem himself. Fungo seemed to buy it, and Jim Garfield was hoping that he might now lower his guard. But even with his defenses sedated, Fungo's house was still a mighty fortress. Fungo was a gadget guy, and he was always installing locks and bolts and alarms and motion detectors. He had 2 Ishira dogs, and he had knives hidden throughout his house. Those were the things he talked about. No telling what other security devices he had in place. Jim Garfield had decided against taking Fungo in his castle. Instead, he placed a small camera-equipped model airplane in a silent, circular pattern 100 feet over Fungo's house. It was a Remington 7100, an electric-powered model that could fly and glide for 12 hours in normal weather before its battery needed to be recharged in about half that time with the camera running. With video transmission to Jim Garfield's cell, flight time was reduced to about 4 hours. Jim Garfield quietly rode the streets near Fungo's house, occasionally checking the image on his wrist-mounted cell. Should Fungo venture out in the evening, and he did venture out to one of his labs every night, he would trip one of his motion detectors. The camera mounted on the Remington could not pick up much detail, but it could detect Fungo's floodlights. Jim Garfield knew this because he had tested it the past 2 nights while he rode unarmed. Tonight he was armed with 2 silenced automatic pistols. Joe Fungo lived on Fairhill Circle, one of 6 horseshoes that comprised Fairhill Acres. The 6 streets were bisected by Fairhill Drive, the only access road in the subdivision. Fairhill Drive stretched from Coho Road, its only egress, to its terminus at Spooner Park. The plan was fairly simple. If the floodlights lit up in Fungo's backyard, it meant that he was either letting his dogs into his backyard, or else it meant that Fungo was headed towards his alarm-secured garage where he kept his pickup truck. And if Fungo was leaving in his truck, he would trip a second set of floodlights that lined his driveway. Upon spying the first set of floodlights, Jim Garfield would pedal hastily to Fairhill Road. If the second set of floodlights lit up, it probably meant that Fungo was leaving in his truck. Jim Garfield would wait on the roadside at some undetermined point on Fairhill Road and await Fungo's arrival. When he came within 20 feet, Jim Garfield would empty his clip into the cab of the truck. He would then reassess and possibly empty a second clip. He would then flee down Fairhill Road, through Spooner Park, where he would toss the pistols into a slough. He would then pedal through the streets of Houston and throw his bike in the back of his pickup that he had parked inside an industrial park. He would crash the Remington into a wooded lot. Jim Garfield made another lap on Fairhill Circle. He slowed as he passed Fungo's house. Suddenly, his emergency cell vibrated against his stomach. No one ever called him on this number. It was for SOS calls only. Jim Garfield removed the cell and viewed the number. It was David Hunter Duncan. With trepidation, Jim Garfield raced down Fairhill Road to its end, where he slipped between concrete pillars at the rear entrance to Spooner Park. He sped down the dirt bike path and was soon in the middle of a dark, grassy field in the heart of the park. There he punched in the commands for the Remington to rendezvous with him. As he waited for the Remington's arrival, he returned David Hunter Duncan's call. "It's Delbert Wayne. He's in trouble. Big trouble." Jim Garfield listened attentively to David Hunter Duncan as he crash-landed the Remington 50 feet away, using controls on his other cell. Delbert Wayne's situation was indeed bad. He had been arrested on federal drug charges in Memphis. Jim Garfield promised to meet David Hunter Duncan in 1 hour at Chesty's Diner. In the unlighted field, Jim Garfield removed the camera from the Remington and disassembled the wings. He hastily shoved the components into his pack and retraced the path he had taken the past 2 nights. After throwing the bike in the bed of his Ford pickup, he climbed into the cab. There, he removed his Houston Cougar sweatshirt and slipped on a black and white Harley-Davidson t-shirt. He was ready to dine with David Hunter Duncan. Jim Garfield repositioned himself against the brown vinyl seat back. He and David Hunter Duncan had grabbed the last empty booth. Chesty's was always hoppy no matter what time of day or night. There was a Denny's on the other side of the parking lot and a Waffle House down the road, but Chesty's patrons consider those places a bit fancy for regular dining. Unsmiling waitresses asked the patrons, "What can I get you?" with the solemnity one might ask the condemned what he wanted for his final meal. The customer never saw a lot of smiles. When he did, they didn't see a lot of teeth. Chesty's was labeled a truck stop minus the trucks, and most of the patrons would easily blend in at an interstate oasis. A failed rock singer who had changed his name to David Allen Joe bleated out his trademark, "Who was your nigger last year?" Above the synthesized steel guitars, Jim Garfield listened to his dinner companion with rapt attention. "That boy had it rough," David Hunter Duncan explained over chili dogs and fries. "He sold his little sister the designer drug that took her life. He always blamed himself for her death. That's why he started selling crank. He wanted to get back to the basics." Jim Garfield listened quietly as he studied David Hunter Duncan's face. He had never looked so old, so tired, or so scared. He was fearless in his own matters, but he was clearly frightened for his son. Delbert Wayne, David Hunter Duncan's firstborn, was 28. David Hunter Duncan and his wife Hope had another son who died in a motorcycle accident while David Hunter Duncan was in prison, and a daughter died from a fatal mixture of prescription and illicit drugs. Delbert Wayne and his young family were all they had left. Jim Garfield savored the Del Rayo chili and tried to figure out David Hunter Duncan's plan. "Remember all those wild ideas we had?" David Hunter Duncan interjected. "When we get on Easy Street, we're going to have hideouts over the place. A fishing lodge in Canada. We'd have a sanctuary in one of those old western ghost towns. We'd convert abandoned mines into mansions, and no one would ever know about it. You still got those maps of the Caribbean?" And David Hunter Duncan recycled many of the plots and plans from their someday file, and then he grew extra serious. "Maybe someday has arrived." Jim Garfield placed another half spoon of Del Rayo chili in his mouth. David Hunter Duncan had a penchant for grandiose schemes. He was always planning. Always. Then he would run his plans by Jim Garfield and Ray, and they would offer gentle criticisms, and David Hunter Duncan would listen carefully and move on to the next plan. He might not listen this time, Jim Garfield considered. He might not listen to anyone. We could live on the highest seas and sit in pineapple until it changed our DNA, David Hunter Duncan rambled on earnestly. By the time he paid the tab, Jim Garfield knew that David Hunter Duncan's spirit would not be bridal this time. A lifetime's collection of grandiose notions were about to take shape in the material world. Even for the unflappable Jim Garfield, that thought was terrifying.